Good morning, everyone. We started this series a few weeks ago called I Am Jesus. We're talking about the I Am statements out of the book of John that Jesus made about himself that were all direct claims of him being the Messiah. So we looked last week at John 8 where Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Well, he makes that statement again in John 9, and since there's a couple of the I am statements that we'll look at next week that really fit really well together, I wanted to take today to go a little bit deeper into the idea of I am the light of the world. And so we'll be looking at John 9 here in just a few minutes. But again, just that idea last week, he said, I'm the light of the world, and it was in relation to the Feast of Tabernacles, and he said that statement inside the temple courts in front of the offering place at the same time that they would have lit up the temple with candelabras at night at the first night of the Feast of Tabernacles. And it said that those candelabras could be seen throughout all of Jerusalem. They were that bright, which is pretty incredible to think that time period that they could light up something that well. But that was the backdrop. Well, we don't know really exactly how long it was after that first one that he says the next I am statement, the I am the light of the world in chapter 9. But again, we'll get to that in just a moment. A few years ago, I got into a show on Netflix. It's a Marvel Universe show. It's a Marvel comic show. They did a movie about it a few years before that was not well received, but the show itself was very well reviewed. I haven't gotten to watch the next season of it yet, but the show is called Daredevil. Is anybody familiar with the idea of Daredevil? I figured Todd would be. William? Yeah, I figured. Daredevil, the basic premise of the show is that the main character, and I can't remember his actual name, but he's known as Daredevil. Okay. But anyway, he's blind. But at the same time, he's one of the best martial artists in the world. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody in his real regular life that knows him knows that he is this superhero that goes around fighting crime at night. And those that he fights probably don't realize that he's blind. But the show is just action-packed. It's one of those. But the idea is that he is blind, yet he has honed his other senses to the place that he is just completely able to fight and take care of bad guys in the world that he's living in. And that got me to thinking, have you ever dealt with somebody that was blind? It's been a long time, but I have been around people that were blind at times, and sometimes it's hard to really know how to interact with them at times. And I forgot to warn you, Kelly, sorry, but there was a little while when we were first dating that Kelly was having some problems with her eyes, and they had taken her to the Cincinnati Eye Clinic in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they couldn't really figure out what was going on, but one of the possibilities of what was taking place was that she had a disease that would eventually cause her to go blind. Well, thankfully, prayerfully, that was not the case. It ended up being nothing other than some glasses fixed the issue eventually. But there was a time that we thought that we were going to have to deal with the idea of Kelly losing her sight the rest going forward in her life. Now, while we're not talking about physical blindness this morning, we're talking about spiritual blindness, but Jesus did, most of the time, he would use a physical ailment to talk about a spiritual matter. That was what his parables were. That was what a lot of how he taught was. He would take something physical and teach in a spiritual manner about that. So he used an encounter with a physically blind man, that's the story that we'll be talking about in John 9, to turn the conversation to spiritual blindness. But before we get into that story, let me set it up a little bit for you. Again, last week we were talking about Jesus saying, I'm the light of the world, that we live in a dark world, that we only see clearly because of Jesus. We only see clearly through Jesus because He is the light of the world. He illuminates the darkness. We talked about being in a cave and being in complete darkness, and all it takes is one little speck of light, and you can start to see the darkness disappears. And Jesus is that light of the world for us. So we go back to that idea of Daredevil for a moment. He's blind, but he learns how to hone his other senses. He learns how to adapt. In a lot of ways, he can see more than others can truly see. And that's the way we see when we're in a relationship with Jesus. That's the way we can do that. Because when we acknowledge that we're blind without Him and that we need Him to see what is around us spiritually, He helps us hone our other senses spiritually. He helps us grow in our walk with Him and in our spirituality. So our continued I am statement again comes on the heels of Jesus' teaching at the Feast of Tabernacles and His original light of the world statement. So we'll just go ahead and jump to John 9. We're going to be reading the entire chapter. It will be on the screen as well, but we'll read sections at a time and talk about that. So it begins, as He was passing by, He saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked Him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now that seems to be an odd question to us. Who sinned, him or his parents? Well, there was an idea in Jewish thought that sin could begin in the womb and that physical ailments were directly caused by sin. So that was a valid question that in Jewish thought, either did this man sin and because of that he was born blind, or was he being punished for something that his parents did? But Jesus answered in verse 3, He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. Jesus answered, this came about so that God's works might be displayed in him. We must do the works of Him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming and when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I'm the light of the world. So He says neither, it's not about sin. This happens so that God will be glorified, that God's works might be displayed. And then He follows that up with, I'm the light of the world. And when it's daylight, there's work to do. When night comes, work ceases. But as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And then verse 6, He says, after He said these things, He spit on the ground, made some mud from saliva, and spread the mud on his eyes. Go, He told him, wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he left, washed, and came back seeing. His neighbors and those who had seen, let me back up, verse 6 and 7 there. We also find that kind of odd. He spits on the ground and makes mud. But in ancient times, in this time period, it was thought that that saliva had medicinal value. Most doctors would use it in that sense. And it's not that Jesus thinks that this is the case, but He's taking into consideration the thoughts of His patient, the thoughts of the person that He's dealing with. He's giving the man confidence that what he's doing will heal him. And then He sends him to the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam was very important in Jerusalem. It was the pool that water was run into from outside of Jerusalem. It was their water source in times of being sieged. It was the only water source if Jerusalem was under attack. His neighbors, picking up in verse 8, His neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar said, isn't this the man who used to sit begging? Some said, he's the one. Others were saying, no, but he looks like him. And he kept saying, I am the one. So they asked him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and told me, go to Siloam and wash. So when I went and washed, I received my sight. Where is he then? They asked. I don't know, he said. So those around him were arguing back and forth whether this was truly the man that had been born blind or if it was somebody that just looked like him. He says, no, I am the man. And he says, a man named Jesus. That's very important. We'll pick up on this progression of who this man thought Jesus was. First, he just thought he was a man named Jesus told me to spread mud on my eyes and told me to go wash. Continuing on in verse 13, it says, they brought the man who used to be blind to the Pharisees. The day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. And then the Pharisees asked him again how he received his sight. And he said, he put mud on my eyes. He told them, I washed and I can see. See, Jesus had a pattern of doing things that the Pharisees didn't think was right, doing things on the Sabbath. The Pharisees were the ones that had set in place that no work could be done on the Sabbath, but they defined what work was. And basically, you couldn't wear a sandal that was held together by a nail because the weight of that nail would be considered work. That's how strict they had gotten with this. So making mud, healing on the Sabbath was completely against what the Pharisees thought. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a sinful man perform such signs? And there was division among them. So they were even arguing amongst themselves. This isn't right because it's done on the Sabbath. This man can't be from God. But then how can somebody that's not from God do such a miraculous thing? Again, they asked the blind man, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? Here's the next progression. He is a prophet, he said. The Jews did not believe this about him, that he was blind and received sight, until they summoned his parents, or summoned the parents of the one who had received his sight. So they asked them, is this your son, the one you say was born blind? How then does he now see? So they were trying to find any excuse to say that this wasn't the man that was born blind. The parents answered, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, his parents answered. But we don't know how he now sees, and we don't know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jews, since the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him, meaning Jesus, as Messiah, he would be banned from the synagogue. This is why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So in other words, the parents weren't willing to stick their own neck out. They said, let our son deal with this on his own. He's old enough, he can answer the question. So continuing in verse 24, it says, so a second time they summoned the man who had been blind and told him, give glory to God, we know this man is a sinner. In other words, confess that this was the power of God, that this was not of Jesus. And he answered, whether or not he's a sinner, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, now I can see. Sounds like a hymn that we sing sometimes, doesn't it? So a second time they summoned the man. Wrong place. Verse 26, then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? I already told you, he said, you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you? So he kind of flips it back on the Pharisees, on the Sanhedrin. You don't want to become his disciple, do you? You can imagine they probably didn't like that very much. He continued, they ridiculed him. You're that man's disciple, but we're Moses' disciple. Like we talked about last week, Moses was considered basically the highest level of Hebrew. And Jesus was making a claim that he was even better than Moses. They're saying, you're this man's disciple, but we're Moses' disciple. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but this man, we don't know where he's from. This is an amazing thing, the man told them. You don't know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. So you may not know where he's from, but he's done something for me. He opened my eyes. And we know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he listens to him. In other words, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did for me if he was not of God. Throughout history, no one has ever heard of someone opening the eyes of a person born blind. And if this man were not from God, he wouldn't be able to do anything. You were born entirely in sin, they replied, and you are trying to teach us? And then they threw him out. It's important to note here that this was only one of two people that Jesus healed that said that they had been ailing for their entire life, that they were born that way. We see it in Acts, a few others, but Jesus only, that we have recorded, only healed two people that were inflicted from birth, and this is one of them. And they just, basically, you were born entirely in sin, whether it was you or your parents, they don't really say, but you're trying to teach us, that holier-than-thou attitude that the Pharisees had. And continuing 35 through 41, this is where we really get Jesus' teaching in this. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and when he found him, he asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" So the guy first said he was a man named Jesus. Then second, he was a prophet. And Jesus asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" he asked. And Jesus answered, "You have seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking with you." And the man replied, "I believe, Lord," he said, and he worshiped him. But Jesus doesn't very often in his encounters make a direct claim like that either. But he does to this man, and this man says, "I believe." Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, in order that those who do not see will see, and those who do see will become blind." Some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and asked him, "We aren't blind too, are we?" "If you were blind," Jesus told them, "you wouldn't have sin. But now that you see, we see, your sin remains." So basically, Jesus is saying you're spiritually blind if you don't understand who I am, if you don't understand that I am from God, that I am the light of the world. You're not seeing correctly. This man who was born blind, Jesus uses as an example of spiritual blindness and how through Jesus we get rid of spiritual blindness. That's a great thing for us because I know I go spiritually blind sometimes. I know I'm probably not the only one in this room that does. But through Jesus, through the light of the world, we can see clearly. Now, one of the other things that I wanted to point out with this too is he says, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world, and when there is light, there is work to be done." If you're a follower of Jesus, there is work to be done. We talk about this often, that part of our work is going out and sharing that light that Jesus gives us, sharing that with others, so that they may have a chance to see clearly. We have a few opportunities to help with that here in the near future. We've got camp coming up to where we can take kids to help them see clearly who Jesus is. We've got VBS coming up. We've got the Walleye Rodeo coming up where there will be thousands of people in this town that we have a chance to interact with. There's ways that we can work. There's ways that we can share Jesus in all of those. If you have the light of the world living in you, don't hide it under a lampshade. If you have any decision you need to make this morning, now's the time to do so as we stand and sing, "I Surrender All," number 596.